everybody, welcome to another episode of the LitRPG Podcast. I'm Ramon Mejia. I'm here to bring you the latest LitRPG news, reviews, and of course author interviews, episode number 145 of the show. 145 episodes, folks. That's a lot of LitRPG. Almost the end of the year, and then as per our tradition, one of our anonymous supporters of the podcast donates every year, and it's like, oh, just the one thing I asked, he or she asks, is that you do something festive during December, and so decided to wear a nice holiday hat. I'm actually thinking about also doing some Christmassy sweater weird stuff, but we'll have to see how that works out with shipping and handling and getting it here in time for the rest of the month. But this week I have five new LitRPGs for you folks. Before we begin, of course, I want to give a quick shout out to a couple new Patreon supporters. They're also wonderful. We have Willie Williams and Michael Reynolds. They both decided to donate monthly to the podcast via the Patreon, and thank you guys. Just thank you for helping to support the podcast. It can be free for everyone, keeping it ad free, and just thank you very much for your amazing support. Of course, anyone else wants to help support the podcast that way, you can find us at patreon.com/Geek Bites Podcast. Actually, yeah, Geek Bites Podcast. So that's the first podcast I did. LitRPG Podcast came later, but I figured, hey, why twits patrons? So that's where you can find us. But thank you very much, everyone, for your support. Okay, into new releases and reviews. We're going to be starting off with 5 new LitRPG reviews for you folks, including Gearing Up, Apocalypse Gate Author's Cut Book number 3. I do like the fact that the authors actually just embrace the author cuts portion of it. So, yay. Also, going to be reviewing The Sleeper Must Awaken to the 20-Sided Eye series, book number 3. After that, it'll be Dead Must Die, a novella of the realms, a humorous GameLit adventure, the realm short story, book number 1. After that, it'll be Cultivating Chaos, VeilVerse, Cultivating Chaos, book number 1. And I want to say companion piece, but it's set in the same universe. Asgard Awakening, VeilVerse, Asgard Awakening, book number 1. I'll also be talking about those two specifically about that shared universe experience and that particular project that both Blaise Corbin and William D. Rand have been working on. So my thoughts on that as well. Before we get on that, we're going to go into, of course, LitRPG news. And in LitRPG news, we actually have quite a few stories this week for the podcast for LitRPG news, including the Facebook Live done by Mountain Dome Press. They talked to one of their authors, Xander Boyce, about Advent Red Mage, book number 1, and what may be in the pipeline with Advent book number 2. It was like 40 minute kind of interview-ish Q&A kind of concept. I know Dakota Crowd it's his publishing company, Mountain Dome Press. Him and his wife are wonderful people. They've done a couple of these now, and I'm like, oh, super. Some of them are super fun. Some are a little more straightforward, but go check it out if you like Advent. It was a nice little thing. I missed it. I missed the live version personally, and I'm sad that I missed the live version. Otherwise, I would have commented on it. Okay. In other LitRPG news, we also have, this was actually a really fun story. Someone in the wild was talking about LitRPG, and one of the authors shared it, and I was just so happy to hear somebody who's not like necessarily a LitRPG author just talking about in the wild, and it's like, oh, kind of neat. Tao Wong, the author of Adventures on Brad, he noted that his narrator, the guy who does the narrations for Adventures on Brad, was on the D&D podcast. And for about 3 minutes, it's not a long piece, on the podcast, he was talking about LitRPG and his experience as a narrator, being a collaborative storyteller, and doing tabletop dungeon games, and tabletop RPG games. But starting at the 48-minute mark on the episode that came out for November 21st, 2018, called D&D and Improv Comedy. We'll link in the show notes for you guys. He talks about LitRPG, and you can tell nobody else on that show knows what it is. They're like, oh yeah, it's great when fantasy books, introduce interesting things, especially ones from other countries. And I'm like, oh, no one else knows what that is. But it was still super fun for me to see people who aren't necessarily hardcore LitRPG fans talk about it, and other, get any exposure is good exposure, but still. LitRPG out in the wild, fun little thing if you're into that kind of stuff. We'll have the link in the show. It's literally just 3 minutes, but I got super excited just for hearing that little bit. Okay. In other LitRPG news, we have Alaron Kong's The Land Raiders, book number 6 in the Chaos Seed series, was voted customer favorite on Audible for 2018. 2018. Congrats to both Alan and, of course, the narrator Nick Podell for having such a fan favorite audiobook. So there you go. In other LitRPG news, we have Paul Campbell Jr., author of Peaks of Power. He started a Patreon page for fans who want to support him there, and he's offering some very good rewards depending on the tier of support, of course. Custom stickers, ebooks, early chapters of upcoming stuff, signed book versions, merch. He will fly out to you and take you out to dinner if you pay enough. And like that's probably that's like the top tier reward at, like, I think $1,000 a month. So if you're super Paul Campbell fan or Paul Campbell Jr., author of Peaks of Power, then hey, that might be the one for you. So go support the author if you like his stuff. We're going to let it be patreon.com/Paul Campbell Jr., all one word, with Jr. being JR. We'll have a look at the show notes for you guys if you want to check it out and support him there. Another little bit of news. If you're a fan of Life Reset and you want some merch, it's available. Apparently it's going to be at ticktail.com/Shimmerk, which is the author's name. So it's there. There's some nice, I'll zoom in a little bit if you guys can see a little bit better, some t-shirts, there's some mugs. So nice merch if you guys want to go get that taken care of. I'm not sure if Ticktail is a on-demand site or what, but it's Life Reset merch. So there you go if you guys want it. And this is the last little bit of LitRPG news. Super happy, super wonderful thing. The GameLit Society's annual charity drive did great this year. They raised $6,000 for St. Jude's Children's Hospital in just 1 month. So that was absolutely amazing, everybody. We talked about it a few weeks ago, at the beginning of November, I think it was, when it was just starting up. And thank you to everybody who's, super generous. People from readers to authors, everything in between. They were very generous with their donations. But the biggest donator is definitely Dan Chinofen, who gave over $2,000 by himself. So he's probably the most generous bearded man that I know. And I know that sounds weird, but it's still true. So there you go, folks. That's all the LitRPG news. On to things that are out now. These are stories that are out now. I haven't had a chance to read them, but they're recently been published and they're out for you guys to look at. And some of them I'll probably read. That includes Citadel of Smoke, a LitRPG and GameLit novel, Adventure Stonehaven League book number 4. That is out now, folks, for you guys. Also out is the second book in the Hidden Wishes series. That's by Tao Wong. It's more of a urban fantasy story with the main character has LitRPG powers, or like RPG powers. So it's a little more on the urban fantasy side of things, but still LitRPG to me. I like the first book, but it is out now. Also out is Nova Terra Titan. The Titan series book number 1, as is Survive, the Game of Death, a LitRPG survival thriller. That's out now. That cover art looks a little interesting, but it's out. A LitRPG novel, Wild Worlds book number 1, called Crash Course, is out. This one I'm not 100% sure if it's going to be a LitRPG or not, but it says it is in the title. Reading the actual, I haven't read the entire thing yet. I've only kind of scanned through it. It seems more sci-fantasy, but there are mentions of levels and some other gaming stuff, but it's really kind of sporadic in the story, so I'm not quite sure what it is. But it says LitRPG, so I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt until I've actually had a chance to read the full thing, of course. And that's all the new stuff I could find this week that's coming out that I haven't read. Also out is new LitRPG audiobooks, though. We have a couple new titles. Cultivating Chaos. That's right. The novel we're actually reviewing on the podcast this week is also out as an audiobook narrated by Andrea Parsnow. See, I didn't even need a special meme. I remember it all by myself. But Cultivating Chaos is out now as an audiobook as well as an ebook, which is great. Also out is the Grainstone Chronicles book number 2, The Direlands. It popped up on Audible for me as like a new release, even though there is no cover art there. So I'm not sure if this is just a mix-up or something. But in case you haven't read it, apparently there's an audiobook for that particular title. I almost want to say that I thought that I already had an audiobook, but just in case. There we go. And on to upcoming LitRPG, which is where I read off a bunch of stuff that I found on Amazon that's upcoming in the near future. There are a few new additions to this list. Out on December the 10th, it'll be Hero Level Up book number 2 in that series. December the 10th, so not that far from now. December the 14th, it'll be Redemption Rise of the Resurgence book number 3. On December the 16th, it'll be Freehaven Online book number 3 called Winter Dungeon Land. On December the 17th, it'll be True Hero Champion is Playing book number 1. On December the 17th, it'll be Realm of Noria, LitRPG series book number 1, The Birth. On December the 19th, Dungeon Mauling, a LitRPG GameLit novel, The Good Guys book number 3. This one actually had a different cover art before, I just updated it. But again, it's a really fun series. I definitely highly recommend it. On December the 27th, Finding a Body, The Dark Herbalist book number 4. On January the 1st, Break, Evo Born, book number 1. And January the 9th, Level Up, The Knockout, book number 1, which is a written by a different author in the same Level Up universe, but it is a different main character and everything. So there you go. Okay, on to new releases and reviews. Okay, new releases and reviews. We have our first novel, which is going to be Apocalypse Gates, book number 3, Gearing Up, written by Daniel Scheenhofen. Okay, that is 395 pages, $3.99. That is available on Kindle Unlimited. Here's the author's description. Alvin had another rough week, but this time he had Gothi with him. Traveling from Utah to Nevada, they were able to set up 2 more settlements. Then they had to visit the World of Fae to rescue the kids of BD Nevada settlement. Just when things looked like they were going well, the developers got involved. With the very rules of the game changing, Alvin found himself in a new position. Gothi pledged herself to him through the game system, leaving her collared and bound to obey his every whim. Coming to terms with their new relationship, Alvin wondered what would come next. He wasn't expecting a road trip north to loot an abandoned town, nor the dragon that guarded it. What came as the biggest surprise was the chance encounter with the fantasy race whose gate was opened. What would come of this fateful meeting? And the author does warn readers, this book contains adult situations in all their horror and glory, including sex abuse, drug use, murder. It also contains graphic sex scenes, which portray elements of BDSM. You have been warned. And that is absolutely true. The author is not kidding about that, folks. He's just being very upfront. There's some parts of the story that are just not going to be for everybody. But if you're into the third book in the series, hopefully you're aware of that that's the case. But there is definitely graphic sexual content. Also, full disclosure, I received an advance copy for review, purchased it when it became available. But again, there is graphic sexual content, including BDSM and bondage. It makes up like 10% of the novel at most, I think, but some of it is not skippable. Like some of it is woven into the narrative as part of like the main character and Gothi's relationship. And it's not just like these isolated scenes necessarily. So if that is not something you're interested in reading about, don't read this, but otherwise you get a lot of the great stuff that's still part of the series. Book 3, in my opinion, continues all the good things you may love or not love about Apocalypse Gates. Has good RPG action, upgrading, leveling, monster and man fighting. Again, there is sex and intimacy and relationship stuff, and it all seems a little more open because Gothi and the main character, of course, in an actual relationship. And again, this is an adult relationship, and it makes sense within the context of the story, but it is going to be a turnoff for some readers, so just heads up. There's also a new rune system in the novel that lets people upgrade weapons and items. Again, this is mentioned in the novel description, and that the game is constantly changing as like the alien developers or whatever they are update the system. And in this case, this is the kind of a big update in the end of book number 2. Again, there's a new crafting and additive value system to items, rune system. And it actually allows some really interesting bonuses and runes that are stacked correctly. And you know that the main character definitely exploits those new loopholes. The settlement system is also changed in the third novel due to some updates. It shifts as being less important, or at least less focused on the main character controlling everything straightforwardly, which kind of leaves him to kind of do whatever he ever wants to. Go adventure, go do whatever. He doesn't necessarily have to be in control of everything. And I think that's just a distinctive, deliberate storytelling choice from the author to let the story kind of go in different places and not have him like necessarily tethered to specific settlements all the time. Let's see. Most of the story is, again, good action adventure. But of all the books in the series, this one feels like the least goal-focused. I'm not necessarily a bad thing, but it is what it is. Book 1 was the introduction to the system and the RPG Apocalypse. The main character had very clear quests to fulfill certain scenarios. And then it led into like the main sandbox story world. Book 2 focused on settlements, developing them, expanding them, finding new ones to start. So again, very clear goals. Book 3 doesn't really have any goals like that necessarily. It's very slice of life. Like the only real like clear goal in the novel is, hey, let's go see the forest. And again, it's a very much more of a slice of life kind of story this time, which is again not bad necessarily, but it is a slight change in the storytelling. And again, this seems to happen a lot with the author's stories as they go on. They become a little more slice of life. That seems to be the author's like storytelling type, because you can just kind of like flow right, and that's perfectly fine. Just be aware of when you know what this is going to be before you start. There are still some very good stories here, and there's some setup for some even better ones in upcoming books. But the novel description kind of tells you all like the big points of like what's happening in the story. Again, it's very slice of life. We're just following the main character in Gothia this time, and it's good adventuring stuff. So it's good for me. Give it a score of 7.4 out of 10 for Gearing Up Apocalypse Gates Author's Cut book number 3 with a score of 7.4 out of 10. There you go. Okay, on to our next review. It's going to be The Sleeper Must Awaken, the 20-sided die series book number 3, written by Kip Tarrington. Okay, it is 457 pages. Ooh, it's a massive one. At $2.99, so a very good price point. It is available on Kindle Limited. And here is the author's description. Joe has the power. The question is, can he hold on to it? The malevolent kingdom of the night is now aware of his presence. A confrontation is guaranteed, just as Rook intended. Joe provides freedom to the oppressed and enslaved. They flock to his banner. His 9-to-5 job is gone forever, for a ruler of a kingdom never sleeps. He believes this magical world is a game designed for fun, with no real consequences, but he couldn't be more wrong. His AI partner is starting to see this new reality for what it is. Will Joe, in his ignorance, continue to defeat every opponent? Or, in order to survive, must he be awakened? Someone is going to die the final death. There's no way around that. Only who? Okay, so that's definitely a tease of like a kind of a big plot point, but it's a very entertaining story. Book 3 in this series continues the good LitRPG storytelling, though a few things do change that I think most fans were going to enjoy. Joe, the main character, finally knows that the world is not a game. That's kind of implied in the story, in like the novel description, him being awakened. I think it's an important thing to clarify because to me it's a really big improvement in the storytelling, and that's because the previous point of view of the main character, where everything's a video game and him and the AI Spooky are the only ones who think that way, kind of limited the way that the story could be told. And it was kind of an annoying thing because the main characters seemed like a good guy and he seemed great, but his attitude of everybody's NPC, so they don't really matter, didn't really mesh well with that hero persona that he was definitely going for. And once that was stripped away, I feel like the storytelling kind of opens up a lot in that he can have like genuine feelings and interactions with the other characters in the story without just seeing them as just being bits of code. And I think that's definitely an improvement for me, which is why I mentioned it as a definite plus. Additionally, I think one of the most common complaints about book number 2 was the way that Spooky was handled. And Spooky is his AI fairy companion, dark fairy companion. And that has definitely changed here in book number 3. And I'm not going to spoil like how it changes necessarily, but the character is definitely modified and she feels more like she did in book 1. So that's definitely an improvement for me as well. Also, the novel is focused on Joe. Though you still get some smaller chapters showing what's happening with other kingdoms and the villains and all that other stuff that's still part of the story. But the main character is Joe still. Here it's definitely Joe. Like that, again, the second most common complaint from like reviews for book 2 is like, oh, why are we watching Spooky? Why is this story told from her point of view suddenly? She's not the main character, right? And so that's definitely shifted back to Joe. Joe is definitely, he's the guy, he's the main character, and you get his point of view for most of the novel. So there are some definite changes between book 2 and book 3. Other than those changes, the story is still like the same good action adventure stuff it always was. There's some very funny scenes, including my favorite one is definitely this like little sub story about the lovesick troll. It's a little small bit. I thought it was super hilarious. So it made me laugh out loud. And it was like a lot of little like tiny funny moments and definitely dialogue and stuff. There is some good dungeon crawling here, a minor bit of politics, and a storyline towards the end that I thought was a little bit rushed, or maybe like I thought it could have actually been its own like novel, but instead it's kind of compacted into the end of this one. But there's still some good story twists. It definitely didn't end exactly how I thought it was, which is definitely good. I thought that was like a nice little twist towards the end. So overall, I had a good time with it. Overall, good, entertaining read. Gets a score of 7.5 out of 10 for me. That's The Sleeper Must Awaken, the 20-sided Eye series, book number 3, with a score of 7.5 out of 10. So there you go. Okay. Next, we have Dead Must Die, a novella of the realms, a humorous game-lit adventure, the Realms Shorts, book number 1, written by C.M. Carney. There you go. It is 62 pages. It is $2.99. It is not available on Kindle Unlimited. So basically, you can get The Dead Must Die, or you can go with the last one, which is The Sleeper Must Awaken, and they're definitely different page counts. So this novel came out right off the bat. I was like, that's a little expensive for a short story. It's not also available on Kindle Unlimited, so you're not going to be able to see it unless you actually purchase it. And that's just because I think the author is including it other places on the internet, or also as like part of his bid to get newsletters, or introduction, has an introduction story to like his series stuff. So it can't be on Kindle Unlimited, unfortunately. But here is the author's description. Simon died once. He'll be damned before he dies twice. Simon never asked to become a new dungeon master of the Barrow, but a millennial-old teenager stuck in the skull of a dead lich has few life options. After bonding with the Barrow's dungeon core, he learns they are near death from hunger, and only by consuming the life energy and experiences of sentient beings can they survive. Lucky for Simon, a party of murderous adventurers invades the Barrow in search of treasure and glory. They look to be a perfectly tasty meal until one transforms into a mentally unstable fanatic whose specialty is killing the undead in all its forms, especially teenagers stuck in skulls bonded to dungeons. If Simon can't master his new powers, defeat invaders bent on plundering, and convince the Barrow to take a kinder, gentler approach to feeding, then he will die a second time, and this time it'll be permanent. So again, this is a short story novella in the same series as the author's larger series, the Realms. So apparently it's supposed to take place between, I think, book 1 and somewhere between the latest book. It's kind of its own like independent thing, so don't worry about it. If you haven't read anything else from the authors in this series, you don't have to. This is completely independent, although you'll get a few more like laughs if you have. It's a nice dungeon master story. There aren't a lot of RPG mechanics in the story. It kind of I think in a way assumes that you've at least read the first book in the series, but again, you don't have to have. The dungeon has tiers of growth. It has a couple character sheets for the dungeon, including HP, status elements. It has game mechanics in there, and growth, and the dungeon can grow and change, and as it absorbs essence from DC's adventures. So there's a whole like system there, but it's not. It's more of a setup. I was like, oh, this is how things work, and let's go on an adventure. Half the story is from the sneaky dungeon diver's point of view. The other half sets up the new dungeon master and how the two groups eventually interact. It's a neat story. Again, light on LitRPG mechanics, though. And it's a little pricey for almost paying $3 for 62 pages. That's almost, that's almost like, it's almost like 3 cents per page. So I'm like, oh, that's, there you go. So it's a little bit up there. But again, I had a good time with it. It's a short story. I don't mind short stories. Some people have an issue with them. But for me, I think probably the biggest drawback is like the price a little bit. This should probably be like 99 cents. And I think you'll get a little more value for the page count. But that's a personal, author does what he wants. For me, get the score of 7.2 out of 10. Dead Must Die, novella of the Realms, a humorous game-lit adventure, the Realms short story book number 1. So I had a good time with it. There you go. Okay, on to our next little bit. This is going to be the 2 novels in the VeilVerse series that came out recently. I'm just going to fix my hat a little bit here. It's slipping off my head. So, there we go. The VeilVerse novels written by Blaise Corvin and William D. Rand. I'll be reviewing the first 2 novels written by them. The whole universe created by both those authors. The forward of Asgard Awakening, I think, does the better job of explaining how the two decided to create and write in this shared universe. And the authors are apparently open to other authors writing in this universe. Like, there's definitely plenty of space for authors to write their own independent stories and not have to worry about like these 2 authors necessarily like world building stuff. It's set up very much so that you can have a bunch of different stuff there. So I can see how they're doing it. Having read both novels back to back, though, I don't really know that I would call this a a shared universe story as much as I would call it a shared multiverse story, with good crossover possibilities. The Cultivating Chaos and Asgard Awaken are both set on different planets or alternate realities. I'm not really sure which it is yet. It's not like 100% clear, but I'll just refer to them as different planets for now. Each novel has its own like magic or key system. There are different timelines, unique cultures, different writing styles, and different sub-themes between like the two novels. If I hadn't been told in advance by the shared cover art design and the forwards, I'm not really sure that I would actually have known that they're in a shared multiverse. The story universe is set up so that there are an infinite number of planets that exist and grow independently. But sometimes, either by accident or on purpose, a rift in time and space occurs connecting these worlds, allowing for humans and creatures to cross over and kind of grow and like maybe migrate. It's called a rip in the veil. Hence the name VeilVerse. That's what allows for some crossover between the residents of these worlds. However, these two stories do have things in common, things that do cross over. The two novels have the exact same prologue. They are both very much slice of life novels. They both have the same types of creatures inhabiting them. In these two novels specifically, they have humans and kin, which are beast people. And though those entities and those races are treated differently in each novel, they do share, again, the same connectivity. People from both novels are aware of the other worlds. There was sometimes like raids between them, so there was actual like content and connection between them. The two main characters of the novel are both cousins and were both transported from Earth at the same time, just to different worlds. And there was one scene in each novel where both characters exist in the same place, but it's really only like an instant. So there you go. There are definitely story threads in each novel that make crossovers easy and almost inevitable in future books. But other than that, at least for now, each book kind of feels like its own thing. You don't have to have read either one of them to read the other. Like you can just read Cultivating Chaos and you'll be fine. You can just read Asgard Awakening series and you'll just be fine. You're not missing out on anything if you just read one or the other. Okay, and that's kind of what I think it's a nice product. I think it's very interesting. And I think it actually allows the VeilVerse allows for a lot of opportunities for just a bunch of authors if the creators want to allow them to create their own independent stories. Like I said, there's literally an infinite number of like magic systems, universes that can be set in the same kind of VeilVerse. That's why I call it more of a multiverse, because it almost reminds me of the way that the CW does the DC universe with like the Flash and Green Arrow, or is it Arrow and Supergirl? They're all in the CW, and once a year they do this crossover event where everybody gets together and they usually go through some portal to maybe some alternate dimension. And that's kind of what I feel like this is eventually going to be like. They're each going to have their own independent series, and then sometimes they're going to have some crossovers, and that's perfectly fine. It's a very interesting system, and it's a very interesting world building choice. So there you go. Okay, on to the actual reviews for these novels though. Okay, first we're going to start off with Cultivating Chaos. VeilVerse, Cultivating Chaos, book number 1, written by William D. Rand. Okay, the novel is 225 pages. It is $4.99. It is available on Kindle Limited, and here's the author's description. Ash led a very normal life by his own standards. It had its ups and its downs, much like anyone else's. Being a talented martial artist had definitely been an up, while high school as a whole was a down. His own father not being a great role model, and his uncle being everything he wanted to be. To Ash, it felt like a very normal life. Right up until the time he was literally pulled into a portal that spat him out into another world. One that was full of martial arts that the practitioners of such used magic to employ, to set their very air on fire with a punch, or turn their skin hard as diamonds, to fly through the air if they had enough power. A world where the strong ruled and the weak died. 3 years of living this life as one of its citizens, those without power, and Ash has figured out how to survive, with his adoptive family and a lot of persistence. His goals in life have become to give back to those who gave to him, and he'd do whatever he had to do that. Except, Ash is about to get his life turned around again. Turned around and altered completely. He's about to discover a treasure from a time long lost, forgotten. A treasure that is going to change his destiny and give him another direction if he wants it. A cultivator. This is a VeilVerse novel. Okay, so there we go. The author also does warn that it contains graphic violence, undefined relationships, a full harem, unconventional opinions and beliefs, and a hero who is tactful as a dog at a cat show. So there we go. This is a light LitRPG action-oriented novel with cultivation, Wuxia, and martial arts and a PG harem. The side story The story side of things is essentially slice of life. You follow the main character as he lives in this Wuxia world, inspired world. There's cultivation. He trains as a martial artist. He seeks to help his adopted family, fights in tournaments, and gives just desserts to the arrogant, pompous bullies of the world. There are also some very nice story arcs, but I'm not going to ruin those for you. And so that's essentially what it is. So it's basically a slice of life story. You follow the main character. He does a bunch of extra stuff. He does some martial arts. He does fights a lot. And you just kind of follow him as he goes on these adventures and builds his harem. And he, does some stuff. I'm not going to spoil the storyline, but again, that's basically what this is. And that's really good for me. I enjoy these slice of life novels. They're really fun and relaxing to kind of get into. This one does some decent world building, and we'll get into like the other concepts though. The game mechanics side of things are light though. There is a cultivation-based progression system. People increase their cultivation by levels. There is a distinct power curve for the main character. And eventually the main character gets a game-like user interface to see people's health and key levels. But it's very much just him. He's the one who sees it that way through like the power of his magic ring. We'll just call it that for now. However, the progression system and the cultivations in general system, it's not really super deep or detailed. That's one of the drawbacks for me. It's a very nice system. It's just not super deep, and it is what it is. The cultivation levels are mostly used to differentiate the relative powers between the characters, and that's mostly what you're going to see it used as. But it does exist. That's why I said it's a light LitRPG, because the mechanics are used by everybody. Everybody who's a cultivator uses the same exact system. There are like some specialties in like certain types of key energy, like they're elementally based, like wood, fire, metal, whatever. But even that's like only mentioned a couple times, like a couple sentences in the entire thing. So again, not a particularly deep system. So if that's what you're coming for, you're going to be disappointed. But if you can just accept that this is light LitRPG, you might have a good time with it. Cultivation, the novel, while the key to increasing power is again the least detailed. And I'm separating this from the game mechanics a little bit just because there are other LitRPG novels that use cultivation, and I'm trying to give you a basis for comparison. I've only read a few other novels that use cultivation as a progression system, including The Divine Dungeon and The Ten Realms. Those are the other two novels I can think of that use cultivation and are also LitRPG. And of the three, including this one, this is definitely the least descriptive. And that's kind of unfortunate because I can see it as a really great way to include some unique ways of building powers and building a magic system, and it's just like it's not that super well developed. I said there's a few mentions of like the main character actually cultivating, and it kind of comes down to in this novel of them being like he visualizes his key pool and he compresses it and folds it and until he can't anymore, and that's it. That's as much cultivation information as you get in the novel. He does it a couple times, and eventually in the novel it stops showing that at all in detail. And it's just like, oh, he cultivates for a couple months, or he continuously cultivates. And that's as much detail as you get for the cultivation system, unfortunately. In other novels that I've read, including in Blood Divine Dungeon and The Ten Realms, they go into like super gritty detail about like specific steps to do cultivation, geometric patterns their mana has to be shaped into, defined principles. They differentiate between sometimes body cultivation and spirit cultivation, and there's like a lot more detail in these other novels. But again, it's not necessarily bad. Again, it's just it is what it is. This is again not a particularly detailed either RPG system or cultivation system apparently, and that's unfortunate because I could see a lot of people enjoying those aspects if they were just more detailed. The harem aspect in the novel is, again, very PG. There is inference of sex in the novel, but it's very fade to black. Otherwise, the aspect does happen very much like the author's other series, Supercells and Superheroes, where the main character has a lot of women who care about him. But he ultimately specializes them in particular areas to fill and balance the team. And it's more about like him creating a team full of women than like having romantic relationships with everybody. He has a romantic relationship with one, maybe two people. And everybody else is kind of like, oh, I'm just filling up my team. They all just happen to be hot women. And that's kind of the same way he does it. The author does it with Supercells and Superheroes. So if you like that harem aspect from that novel, it kind of comes up again, and that same kind of pattern here. However, let's get to some of the really great stuff here. The combat in this novel is definitely the highlight. I think that's the thing that most people really enjoy from the reviews. The action is really frenetic. It's really fast paced. The martial arts stuff is really well done. The combination of martial arts and key based abilities kind of gives all the fights a Hunter x Hunter vibe. And if you've ever seen that anime, it's really action paced and there's really fun powers there. And it's one of my favorite animes. So it's definitely a compliment to compare to this novel at this point. But the action in the novel is definitely like the big thing you're kind of come for. There are a couple drawbacks in the story that I thought were like, oh, these are decisions. One, all the power the main character gets kind of feels unearned to me. And it's literally every technique, every skill, every power boost, and every ability to cultivate comes from a magic ring. And the main character just kind of does a search query, and then all the information is downloading to brain, and he's suddenly a master of that skill, trait, technique, or whatever. And even though the main character uses all those skills and techniques very intelligently and spars and cultivates, again, every time I read about him like doing well in a novel or in a fight or in whatever, I'm like, oh, that all the power kind of fundamentally doesn't come from him directly. And it's a little bit like slight turn off. And again, I don't know if that concept and that bit is something that's very common in the Wuxia novels, or if it's just this novel. I don't know, but still, that's probably the only drawback on it. And even that didn't like ruin the story in any shape or form for me. So like, it's just kind of a thing. I'm like, oh, that's unfortunate, but still very good action. I think that's kind of make up for more than that. Overall, good entertaining story. And again, there's just like a little bit that brings it down for me a little bit in small ways, but it's again a great action adventure story, interesting storylines that can be entertaining the entire way through. Gets a score of 7.6 out of 10 for me. So that's Cultivating Chaos, VeilVerse, Cultivating Chaos book number 1 with the score of 7.6 out of 10. I had a good time with it. It's really enjoyable, but again, just be aware of what it is. There you go. Okay. Last review. It's going to be Asgard Awakening, VeilVerse, Asgard Awakening book number 1, written by Blaze Corvin. It is 240 pages. It is $4.98. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. Okay, here's the author's description. After years of slavery, subjected to torments of body and spirit by the inhuman kin, Travis Sterling can barely recall his old life. Memories of Earth and disappointing his family barely seem real anymore. But even without the occasional voice in his head, Trav knows he's different. A vast amount of rune crafting knowledge has mysteriously taken up residence in his mind. Too bad he doesn't have any mystical power. If he could find a way to actually use any rune magic, his situation would change. The stubborn, unbroken man burns for justice, but despite his strange abilities, he stands no chance against the kin. In the near future, when Trav comes face to face with complete destruction, his mettle and creativity will be tested. Will he perish, or will he grasp a chance to shake the foundations of this new world? A VeilVerse story. The author does also warn, this series is written for adults. Asgard Awakening contains morally gray situations, polyamory, fantasy violence, and slavery. So there you go. And it also says, please don't attempt dangerous rune magic at home. So for a bit of humor. This is definitely a more brutal slice of life story than I thought it was going to be. Like the first few chapters, it's like it's gritty and dark. It's like the main character Travis has been a slave for 3 years. He's recently saw his wife murdered, who he got on this new world. And it's definitely some gritty stuff. I was like, oh, that's definitely gritty and dark. I think it's definitely up the author's alley too. Like, I think he really likes writing these kind of stories. But from there on in, it's really kind of, again, a slice of life story. The main character picking up new women or kin for his harem. There's a lot of good Norse themes of powers and storylines and struggles with other gods. But it's mostly about the main character traveling, getting to as many fights and adventures as possible, and expanding his power as he expands his group of friends, Valkyries, or lovers. I really do like the opening of the storyline. I think it's probably my favorite part of the story, in that the main character mourns for his wife. Like, you never see the wife. You're really just getting his point of view of loss at her being gone, and how it shapes his behavior as a man and as a human, as a hero. It's actually, I think it's a really great way to humanize the main character. And even though he does some brutal stuff to survive in the mines, it's still that little bit of like him remembering who his wife was and cherishing their moments and basing it just like, oh, what would she have wanted for me to do? Is it, like, to me, a great way of like just letting the reader empathize with the character. So good job on that. Unfortunately, it doesn't follow through a lot of the story, but it's still good stuff while you get it. I also really like the rune crafting system in the story. It's great, flexible magic, and is gradually developed and expanded by the author as the story goes on. Personally, I would have loved more details, but that's me. I'm a nerd for those kind of details. And I would have loved to see quantified mana cost and capabilities like runes versus glyphs versus like symbols or whatever it is in the novel. This system is a little overpowered by the end of the story, but it's a really fun magic system, and all the things they've been at it. It's really flexible. I like this system a lot. Now here's the big question. Is this LitRPG? Nope, it isn't. And that's unfortunate because like I said, I like the story itself, but it is not LitRPG, at least for me. There's no RPG progression system. The closest you get is at the 56% mark and at the 70% marks. At the 56% mark, the main character chooses to think of his mana in terms of mana bars, then increase every time he binds a woman as a Valkyrie. And it's an internal visualization system that the main character does, though no one else in the entire world views mana in those terms. Like there's literally a paragraph in the novel where the main character, like he's like, he has like a bunch of runic knowledge that have been downloaded in his mind. Is like he's choosing to think about his mana in terms of like game mechanics, and he's like, I have a bunch of tables I can figure out, and it almost feels like one of those scenes in the Detective Story where like Sherlock Holmes or someone else is like thinking about something. You see a bunch of like visual pictures of like knowledge passing through on the screen. That's kind of what this scene felt like, but it's literally just one paragraph at the 56% mark where this is brought out by the main character, and it's all just in his head. He's the only one thinking about it in this way, and so that's it, kind of just one little bit. At the 70% mark, the main character uses his newly increased mana bars to decide how much he can upgrade his body using runic magic, since the upgrades will require full-time use of some of those magic bars. And this is probably the most kind of game-centric or RPG-centric scene in the entire novel. It's kind of one of the only ones, though. Here in this scene, the main character goes through this process, which is very gamer-centric, a gamer mentality, like considering whether it's best to go melee buffs or be a ranged caster or something else. And it's a really good scene. It's probably one of my favorite RPG scenes. But in total, between those two sections, it only takes up like 5% of the entire story. And that just is what it is. And I think the author kind of realizes that this isn't LitRPG because, and it's okay. It doesn't have to be. The author's not advertising LitRPG or anything like that. But like, there's definitely a section of the novel in the foreword where the author's like, this is GameLit. Some people might think it's LitRPG, and they told me it is. But you get to decide on your own. And I'm happy to, if you read it and you enjoy it, that's all he cares about. So it is what it is. Unfortunately, it's just, there aren't many other places where there's anything like an RPG mechanic. As a matter of fact, for most of the story, I say that the magic system doesn't even really seem to have like this quantified cost for a lot of things that it does. And there is an exception on that, like at the 83% where the main character for one sentence says, all the magic he had just used and all the spells he just were like super expensive and fancy damage dealing spells. He's like, oh, it cost me a whole mana bar. And that's the extent for the rest of the novel. And for most of it, though, it just isn't. And again, it might be something that's improved later in book number 2. And I definitely hope it is, because I can read it and give it good reviews. But for now, this novel just isn't. And again, it's not advertising as LitRPG, so it's not going to get a bad negative score or anything. It's just like, oh, I'm a little sad. I'm like, oh, it didn't turn out to be that thing I love from the author I like and the author I love. So there is no negative score here. But overall, this is still a good story. As portal fiction, I'd say easy, 7.4 to 10. It was very entertaining. If you just want something very actiony with like Norse themes, you'll enjoy this a lot. But as LitRPG, it just isn't. And that's, it is what it is. Like I said, I definitely cross my fingers, hope that the RPG system the author seems to be setting up in book 1 is something that is expanded in book 2 and book 3 and book 4, whatever it is. So there you go. That's my review. So that's it. That's the end of the show, folks. Finished, done, 5 reviews. That's it. So thank you very much for listening, for watching. Hang out with me, folks. If you want to follow us anywhere, get the latest reviews from me and for the podcast, you can always follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, Patreon, our webpage. Facebook page is probably the most easiest place to follow us at facebook.com/LitRPG Podcast. You can always get the podcast every single week there. You can see videos from this podcast and, of course, the LitRPG audiobook podcast, which is a sister podcast that I produce. I don't star in it. I'm not the host, but I do the production on it. So you can find all the reviews we do on a weekly basis there as well. So if you just want to read them instead of listen to them, they're all there as well. Of course, there are also other RPG Facebook groups that you can join and hang out with, including the GameLit Society, and also LitRPG Books and a bunch of other places. If you enjoyed the podcast and want to support us in any way, shape, or form, of course, you can find out all the ways to do so at litrpgpodcast.com patreon.com/support. But until we can hang out again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for talking with me, for watching me. And of course, if you want to comment on the show, feel free to do so. I love hearing from you folks. But until we can hang out again, remember to go read some LitRPG. Goodbye, everybody.